who were in exile?
I think the key word is pain. I think exile was always a very painful experience. People sometimes talk about people in exile having a cushy time, but there are very few people who had a cushy time in exile. Homesickness, loneliness, these were features of exile. Yeah.
Yeah, you spent a lot of time kind of delving in that in the beginning and wanting the reader to understand that although exile meant one thing for others, it did give an opportunity to others to move away from home. And in many ways, some people exiled themselves from whether they were from Durban, moved to Johannesburg. Why was that so important for you, so that the reader understood that?
Well, there were some people who benefited from exile. I think I was quoting Lewis Nkosi, the famous writer, who said that he actually benefited. He never really felt the homesickness, the loneliness that was so much a feature of exile. And certainly the ANC, people in the ANC learned lessons. There were some benefits that could be obtained from exile. The ANC went into exile as a multiracial organisation. It came back as a non-racial organisation. These were changes that took place in exile. There were also many lessons that were learned through living in other countries in Africa, which I think were of benefit to the ANC when it returned to South Africa.
Why is this such an important story to read now? I mean, it's the ANC, it's 102nd birthday anniversary. It's one of the oldest organizations on the oldest organization, liberation movement on the African continent. And yet, although this is a very particular focus from 1963 to 1994, it's an evolving organization that's gone through many changes, and a lot of that, what we see today, was born in that 20 years.
No, I think it is important. I think the exile experience has been misunderstood. One of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I get rather frustrated reading South African journalists' newspaper reports, which always blame, or often blame, things that they don't like about the ANC today on the culture of exile, the exile experience. And I think that's a rather simplistic view. The exile experience was not all bad. There were positive things about it. It strengthened the ANC. But also, it is not true to suggest that the culture of exile was in any way dominant in relation to the ANC over the last 20 years. The culture of the ANC over the last 20 years has been really based on its experience in government. And they came together in government in the ANC, people with all sorts of different backgrounds, people who never left South Africa, people who were in prison, and people who were in exile. So I think there's an overemphasis on what people often say was the negative message or lesson of exile.
An interesting thing that you note in the book as well, in the 60s, the ANC wasn't the only organization that was exiled in Zambia. In actual fact, it was one of 3 at the time, but one of many that was in Zambia.
Yeah, there were 3 South African exile groups there at one point, and there were probably a dozen different liberation movements. Now, in Zambia, the ANC didn't really become the most important liberation movement until after the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980. It was only then that the ANC really became the major liberation movement in Zambia. And until that time, Zambia's focus had to be on the war in Zimbabwe, and before that on Angola and Mozambique. So it was really from the mid-80s that the ANC became absolutely key and a major consideration for Zambian foreign policy as well. The relationship between Oliver Tambo and Kenneth Kaunda is a very important one.
Yeah, that is a very important relationship, and it links to my next question. You describe what it was about Lusaka and what it was about Zambia that felt more at home for the ANC than, for example, Dar es Salaam.
Yes, when Oliver Tambo arrived in Lusaka or in Zambia in the mid-60s, he said, "Oh, it's just like the Transvaal." And I think I quote Ronnie Casuals as saying that Lusaka was very much like a Transvaal town. It's an extension of that. Lusaka is an extension of the Highveld. People who were at home in Johannesburg would be at home in Lusaka. Another important point about Zambia is that the ANC population, which grew to about 4,000 people in 1989-90, was urban-based. It was scattered throughout the town. There were no camps. There's a very big difference between Zambia and Angola, for example, where people were in camps. And I think that, in a way, that was more healthy because the ANC was scattered through, mixed with the Zambian population. It didn't suffer from the same kind of pressures that occur in a camp situation.
Hugh Macmillan, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for talking to us about your offering, the Lusaka Years, the ANC in Exile in Zambia. That, of course, was author, historian Hugh Macmillan talking to us about the book that's available at all good bookstores, and a very compelling read. He is currently a research associate at the Oxford University's African Studies Centre. If you've read it, let us know what you think about the offering. It's called the Lusaka Years, morning live at SABC.co.za.